Hello everyone, I guess hopefully you're having a wonderful day, and today we are here with a video on what soccer pop reports could look like in 10, 20, 30 years on various huge cards in the soccer space in terms of rookies for key players. I am going to stick to rookies for key players and items that are unnumbered because obviously, that's going to make sense and going to be more helpful. Also, I think that is where more of the questions lie. I think this video is helpful because a lot of people have seemingly gone off the grid in terms of soccer card collecting and retreated to collecting numbered modern items. And I totally understand it. I like modern number items as well. We've talked about that before at length, but I think that a lot of people did this more so in the sense that they couldn't trust pop reports and they didn't really have a clue how much was out there. And I think that's totally understandable. But I think at this point in time, we've sort of gone through a boom and then subsequent bust in soccer cards. And the last year to year and a half has been really stable. So I think taking the pop report growth from the last year and using that going forward is going to be an interesting sort of thought process that we can go ahead and experiment with here now. So we'll talk about some of the key assumptions that we're going to have to make before we get into this, just so you know where I'm coming from. First off is that, like I mentioned before, we're going to only use the population changes over the last year to then extrapolate further out. So if there were 20 this year, we'll assume 20 close to 20 next year. The reason it's close to 20 but not 20 exactly is because I'm going to assume that there's some sort of rate of decay in terms of people submitting these. I don't think it'll be the same number each and every year. Now, of course, going forward, there'll probably be years where it's higher than the average, years where it's lower than the average, and so it's difficult, but I'm just going to assume it drops off 5% a year, which isn't anything too crazy in my opinion. But at the same time, at the end of the video, I will give you a way to adjust these numbers if you think it's higher. You could also think it's lower. I really don't know myself, so I went with a pretty conservative estimate, I thought, with 5%. Also, keep in mind that grade is not considered. I'm only taking into account the total number of these submitted. A key factor is that over time, lower and lower grades become higher and higher submitted because basically there are less of the higher grades and demand is typically still there, so lower grades will still get graded, and thus, while populations might rise at the same rate, the populations grade adjusted are actually nowhere near the same usually year over year. And so you could argue in a sense that the numbers that I'll show here today probably account for a lot of the lower grades, and a lot of the cards today will be seen as much higher on that bell curve of grading, but that's, sort of a nuanced way of approaching this. And then finally, I'll be using PSA populations only just because it's very, very simple. A lot of soccer is graded with PSA, so it gives me a good sort of database to go from. So we're going to start big with the 1958 Alifa. I took the 5 GOATs, so Pele, Maradona, Cruyff, Ronaldo, and Messi. In my opinion, I think that those are 5 pretty universally agreed upon, and I think that they are some of the most prominent. So I took a few rookies from each of them and broke them down here. So with the Alifa Pele, we have a current pop of 153. We then have a 2022 to 2023 population increase of 19. Quick little note on that. This is actually 2023 to 2024 total. On every single slide, I wrote 2022 to 2023. Just go ahead and play along with me here. I don't feel like going back through everyone and changing it, so we're just going to stick with it. But this is 2023 to 2024, so the last year, essentially. Anywho, breaking that down further, in 10 years, this leaves us with about a doubling in pop of the Alifa up to 298. In 20 years, we're at 385, and at 30 years, we are at 437. So overall, about a 3x, and over time, that's what we'll start to see, is the average is near about 3 times as much, depending on the rate of growth over the last year. And so it's something like the Alifa, that is a decent number, and I think that that's something we all sort of have to battle with throughout this, is what's a good number for soccer, what makes sense. But ultimately, everyone's left up to their own devices in terms of figuring out what does make sense for them and how much is too much. But, 500 doesn't seem like anything too crazy to me. We'll see some much bigger numbers later and a decent amount of smaller numbers as well. Taking a look at the Aquarella, we have a current pop of 373. We then have 107 a year, so this one gets pretty drastic in the sense that over 30 years, this is almost a 6x increase, somewhere along those lines. After 10 years, close to 1,200, and then after 30, near about 2,000. These are already pretty well graded in low grade, so that is something to consider as well. There are going to be sort of a lot of different things that you could take into account, and so if something's already getting graded across the board in every grade, Typically, I would expect that to slow down because you can't really go much lower. Like with a lot of the things that get graded in high grades, say like a Messi rookie, as time goes on, you start grading a lot of the lower grades, and that sort of fills the void. If you're already grading the lower grades, you can't really fill that void as much, and so that becomes a little bit more tricky in terms of trying to figure out. But ultimately, like I said earlier, this is all just guesswork and a nice thought experiment. I then went with a couple rare Pele rookies just to sort of see where these were going and to give an idea, in similar pop reports, because I don't want to talk too much about these, double-digit pop reports and how those are going to change, because they're probably not too much, and that's what we're seeing here. So the Americana Pele had a pop of 19, or has a current pop of 19. The last year was a +2, so overall in 30 years, we're looking at almost a pop 50, which, again, isn't very much at all. I mean, this is one of the lowest we'll see, if not the lowest. And then we pair that up with the 58 Titulares. This is the vertical headshot version of this sticker, and currently a pop 47. Over the next 30 years, up to about a pop 151. Again, about a tripling there, but, even here, like, just putting these numbers out there is just incredibly, jarring to look at, that a Pele of this caliber is only going to be a pop 150, in theory, if these numbers are correct, yada yada. Again, this is all guesswork. I'm not going to say it much anymore because I don't really care to, but basically, to me, that's a stellar number if you're someone that owns this. Sadly, I don't own this Pele. I wish I did. But that's just crazy to think about. When it comes to the sticker Verlog for Cruyff, this is the earliest sticker he has, but not the best eye appealing. It probably goes to the Palarex, as we'll see here in a second. But this one, current pop of 80, increase of 14 over the last year, which means in about 10 years, we're looking at near 200, and then in 30, near 300. Again, plus or minus, you don't quite know where it's going to end up, but ultimately these, again, don't seem like egregious numbers, especially for, someone of Cruyff's caliber, who probably doesn't get the love he deserves in the hobby. I don't really see too many people piecing Cruyff, or at least making that their entire persona. I'm sure there are plenty that PC Cruyff. As a lover of the game, I definitely have some Cruyff, but I wouldn't call myself a Cruyff, super fan by any means. Keeping it moving, we have a Cruyff Palarex here, so this is a current pop of 83, but only 8 additional Palarex added to the graded pop the last year, so in 10 years this is looking about at 150, and then in 30, close to 200. The Vanderhoot gets a bit populous here, current pop of 247, over the next 10 years, maybe 600, over the next 30, possibly close to 1,000. This is also one that was released over a couple years, so 68, 69, and 69, 70 are both the same exact Vanderhoot sticker, so there's no way of deciphering. It's both a first and second year in regard to the Vanderhoot set. So interesting that comes in so high, but not necessarily all that jarring. We then move on to Maradona. We have the 77 Pog here, currently a pop 83 and 10 additional the last year, leaves us with 159 in 10 years and 230 in 30 years. Pretty crazy number. I mean, when you think about it, I understand why this doesn't get as much love. Personally, I don't have one, would like one. But basically, in terms of being a true rookie, unquestionably in terms of year, it is pretty jarring to see that, only 230 there in potentially 30 years. At the same time, people tend to not like Pogs, so, I get that, and I hope they continue not to, because I would like to get one relatively cheap. Nonetheless, we have a 78 crack Maradona here. I went with this one over the cartoon version just because I think that this is the more coveted, and, rightfully so. Current pop 176, it has a increase of 22 over the last year, which then leaves us with anywhere from 340 to 500 over the next 10 to 30 years. Projected pops are decently high, 3 to 500 anywhere in there. Isn't going to be, I guess, anything too rare in soccer, but at the same time, I mean, in any other sport, and I'm going to refrain from saying this too much, but literally in any other sport, a lot of the pops we're going to show in this video are peanuts. And also at the same time, keep in mind that modern sets, I mean, they have thousands of numbered cards for each player in every single set. And so, sure, hundreds might look like big numbers just because they're not numbered, but if you combine all of the numbered cards in a set for a player, there are so many. I mean, it's just crazy. So looking at, a few hundred in these scenarios of what are cards that, in my opinion, are legitimate grails, it's just crazy to think about. Now we go to one of the more populous of the Maradonas. This is the 79 Calciatore. Current pop's 377 over the last year. 43 added to the graded pack, which isn't too many. I would have expected more considering the pop of 377, but they've sort of slowed down over the last, Projected out 10 years, this leaves us at about 700, 20 years at 900, and then 30 years a little bit over 1,000. And then we'll go to modern day. So Ronaldo, we have his Mega Cracks. Interestingly enough, just ends up being less than the Maradona Calciatori. I guess that goes to speak towards the rarity that you get with countries like, say, Portugal, that's, significantly smaller and less demanding in terms of soccer card collectibles compared to, say, in Italy. But here you have a current pop of 334, a total pop of 38, and this leaves us with 620, 800, and then 900 over the coming decades. Then looking at the sticker here, we have a current pop of 213. We then have a total of 16 added to the pop over the last year, which leaves us with 335 in 10 years, 408 in 20 years, and then 452 in 30 years. So about half as much as the card version of this. Something to keep in mind with stickers, though, is that over time, you would assume that a lot of the stickers that are stuck in albums, if desired enough, will come out of those albums. So really what we're looking at here is more than likely a projection of unstuck stickers. There's probably, surely there are masses more that are stuck that could be graded and, would be graded really, really low, authentic, presumably, and thus there's going to be a huge gap in terms of the high grade and the low grade. How that plays out, I don't know, but basically just keep in mind that for stickers like this one here, we are looking at unstuck. Stuck will be more plentiful, definitely. Then looking at Messi, we have the 71 bis, so the card of the hobby, more than likely. I think that over time this is sort of going to be seen as the staple of soccer, which personally makes sense. Messi's a great player and deserves something that can stand out, but I think the 71 bis with its eye appeal and with its pricing and desirability and availability as well makes it pretty easily one of the best cards, if not the best in soccer, in my opinion. Over the last year, a pop increase of 100, which is pretty sizable. Now, something to keep in mind here, we can see, 1,400 in 10 years, 1,920, and then 2,230. I would be interested how many of these 100 submitted in the last year are either crossovers or resubmissions. I suspect that it's probably more than almost any other item we're seeing here today. So, will that keep up over time? I don't know. It could be artificially a bit high, but at the same time, the 71 bits isn't incredibly hard to find. It's hard and high grade, definitely. But yeah, the numbers here, definitely the first one to break into the multiple thousands, but we'll see another one here in a second. Looking at the Messi Monday Chromo, this one's currently at 1147, and its increase was 169 the last year. Again, you could say the same thing, where there's probably a lot coming over from BGS and whatever other grading companies. Ultimately, this leaves us with 2,400, 3,200, and 3,400 over the coming decades, or at least what this is projecting out to be. Pretty sizable amount, but again, keep in mind, 3,300 on a Messi rookie. Sure, it sounds like a lot now, but in 30 years of adding additional collectors, that might not be anything. It might be a drop in a bucket. Maybe it is a decent amount. Who really knows? But ultimately, the way I would look at it is the soccer space right now is pretty small, and we can take on, almost 1,200 Messi Monday Chromos fairly easily and hold decent prices. So if that's possible, then I don't think, we're wildly far off from being able to hold 3,300. But obviously that's something everyone's got to calculate themselves and sort of understand where they stand on all of that. And then we have the 2004 Campio Messi, the blue variation. This one has a current pop of 1159 and 133 being added each year. I'm pretty sure I combined the pop from the Campio and the Campione together for this one, so you could break it down if you wanted to into each of their own separate categories, but I think they're, basically the same card. Ultimately, this leaves us with 2,200, 2,800, and 3,150 over the coming decades here. Again, pretty similar to the Monday Chromo in terms of total grades, and again, you're going to have to make of that what you will. And then we'll move on to some of the random pre-modern and some vintage that I decided to look up just because I thought that the player and card pairing were notable, and it's just sort of spread out to give us a little bit of an idea of what other areas might look like. So here we have the Zinedine Zidane from 91-92 foot. The current pop is 119. The last year we increased by 14 pop, which ultimately again shows here that we're somewhere between 220 and 320 over the coming decades. As I mentioned before, again, authentics might come in droves, but if we're just counting essentially the unstuck copies, this is what you'd be looking at. We have Mark Van Stefan Bastian next up. Current pop is 41. This one, we had 11 in the last year, so that's probably notable. It seems relatively high, at least from my perspective, because the current pop is 41, so to get in almost a quarter of the population in the last year is really high, especially to what we've been seeing with the other stickers or cards. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but ultimately this leaves us with anywhere from 125 to 205 in terms of the coming decades. This is one where I think, maybe if we average this out over a few more years, it might not be 11 per year. It might be a little less, and thus this might eventually be seen as less populous than we have projected here, but that's just sort of my takeaway from looking at that. We have the Beckenbauer Bergman here with a current pop of 188 projected out. This had 51 come in the last year, and ultimately that leaves us between 570 and 949 between the next decade to 3 decades. And you could probably have pretty similar numbers for the Gerd Muller if you wanted to go ahead and transpose that on over to him. Next, we have the R9 Votball. I decided to use this because at least it's, relatively populous, and we can be able to take something away from how far this is sort of growing. Current pop's 224. Last year was only 23, so if we take that out, 10 years says 400. 20 years says 500, and then 30 is a little bit under 600. Again, these are mostly unstuck copies, so keep that in mind. Next, we have the Bobby Charlton. This is one that I was relatively surprised about. I thought that this one might hit a bit higher, but current pop's 202. The last year, only 34, which isn't anything, I guess, too crazy. Comparatively earlier, some of these, the last year was a third of their total pop. In this scenario, closer to maybe 15%. In 10 years, we have around 460, 20 is a little bit over 600, and then 30 is a little bit over 7. Keep in mind this doesn't include the red and blue back version. It is just the one with this little top tab, so that is something of note. And then the final couple here, we have a Platini from 1974. Was pretty surprised by this one. I was just sort of checking it out because he's in that realm of players that we were just looking up, and he also has one true rookie, so I think that makes it relatively attractive in terms of star and card combination. But the thing that surprised me here, current pop 109, but only 8 in the last year, which was, again, pretty shocking. This leaves me with 170, 202, and 228 over the coming decades. And I think that this offers a little bit more of a true number because you're looking at a closer resemblance of unstuck copies and stuck copies rather than, some of the Panini stickers from earlier where we're basically just looking at unstuck copies. So yeah, here I was relatively surprised that we were, only at 228 in 30 years. But again, that might have just been a pretty low year in terms of numbers submitted with only 8. And then finally, we end with the 1955 Vecchi Garincha. Pop 74 over the last year, a plus of 7 to the pop report, and that leaves us with 130 to 180 over the coming decades. I will say a little bit sad that I couldn't fit in a DeStefano or Puskás in terms of this graded pop report projection. Their cumulative rookies are just really hard to sort out. The true rookies that people sort of see as the go-tos are just so low pop that we're really not going to have a great understanding in terms of how many have been submitted the last year, how that looks long-term, and so I just decided to leave them out since I didn't think that there was a player plus card combo that sort of fit the style of what I was going for here. If you do have other players that you would like to see this on, I definitely wouldn't be opposed to doing another version of this video, maybe with some other cards that I didn't hit on here. There are certainly plenty of others worth talking about, and so if you have any suggestions, feel free to drop them down below, and I'll keep that in mind for a potential second parter. But that leads me to my final thoughts in terms of what we just went through. So the first one is that, across the board, you're only seeing a few hundred to a few thousand on almost everything we looked at. I didn't know what I was getting into when I started doing this. We might have had numbers that were way higher than I thought, way lower than I thought. I thought this was on the lower side. Again, as I mentioned earlier, people look at numbered Messi and Ronaldos that are numbered to 250, and they think that they're, really, really rare. And while it's out of 250, there's an out of 150, there's an out of 100, there's an out of 50, and ultimately that means that in those sets that people care about, there's, 500, maybe 1,000 cards that people view as rare. That's just in 1 year of one set of a card that probably isn't even that big of a deal. We're talking about some of the best cards of these players, at least in terms of notable rookies and all that jazz. Sure, there might be a rarer card out there, and that's definitely worth talking about, but in the sense of trying to figure out projections looking forward, it's not going to be as useful. Ultimately, I was surprised in terms of how low these numbers were, and so the average growth of these items was around 320% over 30 years, and yeah, that can be jarring. I don't know, depending on where you're sort of coming from this. I came in with the assumption that, yes, most of these items are still out there to be graded. Pop reports are nowhere near close to being fully established. I mean, if you go look at the Mickey Mantle pop reports, those are still going up consistently. The difference is there's enough people that demand that card, and there's so little supply relative to that demand to where it keeps up with where it's at and continues to grow. There's nothing wrong with more items being submitted. I think that's actually helpful. I wouldn't want all of us that are in soccer right now to be the only ones that can ever buy this stuff, and then all the people that come after can't, because that's not really an exciting hobby for the people that would come after us, right? So having some room of growth is good. I think 320% isn't anything crazy. Ultimately, if a card's at a pop 150 now, if we were able to take on 150 pop in just a few years, I think we could take on 450 pop over 30 years. Maybe I'm wrong. Again, everyone sort of has to analyze that how they feel fit, but to me 320 didn't seem anything crazy. Like I mentioned, I think that's lower than I would have thought. I probably would have been somewhere in the camp of like 400 to 600 would have been what I would have imagined, but instead it's closer to 200 to 400, which is, you know, about half of what I was envisioning. And then finally, to touch on the rate of decay that I talked about earlier, if you assume that there's no rate of decay, that people will submit the same amount of these items every single year for the next 30 years, well then it's closer to 500%, which is, like I mentioned, closer to what I thought. But at the same time, even when you go through and talk about, you know, 500% increase or whatever it may be, say for instance here like this Zidane, maybe it goes from a pop of 119 instead of 300, you just assume it gets submitted, you know, year after year after year. If you go ahead and assume that 14 a year are going to be submitted over the next 30 years, it's about 450. If you add that to the current pop here, that means we're at, you know, 570. Ultimately, that's not too crazy of a pop, even if you assume there's no rate of decay again. So for me, I just thought that this was a, you know, pretty positive outcome in terms of what the projections were showing. But again, all of this is just sort of guesswork and the best that I can do at this moment with relatively limited time. I'm not going to pour hundreds of hours into this video just to get closer projections, because ultimately at the end of the day, this is all up in the air and still to be decided. But hopefully you enjoyed it. That's going to be it for the video today. Hopefully you enjoyed. Again, if you did, make sure to leave a like. I'd appreciate it greatly. Anything you want to tell me, I'd love to hear it in a comment down below. And if you want to see more videos like this as soon as I go live, do make sure to subscribe. But with that said, hopefully you have a wonderful day, and peace.